from over the course of the 12th and 13th century into the 14th century. A form of evil which is directly traced by the Venetians themselves to the ancient Canaanite city of Tyre, had arisen to great power in the north of the Adriatic Sea, the city of Venice, which has been in recent time, until he moved to London, the residence of Satan on earth. These people grew great power. They built a maritime power in the image of ancient Phoenicia, which is Canaan. Phoenicia is a Greek word. The people of that region were called the Canaanites. And the center of evil was Tyre. Tyre was destroyed by a great man, Alexander the Great. But the principle of Tyre lived on. And it came through the Roman Empire, it came to reside in Venice. And from about 800 AD on, Venice was an increasing power in the Mediterranean. It became a great sea power, which became a dictatorship over the Mediterranean over the period from the course of the 12th century into the beginning of the 13th century with the so-called Fourth Crusade. And I can tell you all the Crusades were frauds. They were all run by the Venetians. Nothing to do with Christianity. They had to do with something else. The Fourth Crusade was organized by Venice to conquer and loot Byzantium, which is its major competitor. And the Latin Empire in Byzantium was set up from 1204 to 1261, when a fellow called Michael Palaeologus overthrew it on behalf of the Greeks. But Venice became a great looting power. It crushed every element of civilization. It imposed evil cults. It spread the cult of Aristotle throughout the Mediterranean and other cults. It looted everything. It imposed its debt every place. It manipulated nations into making war on one another. They weren't real nations, but they were whatever passed for at that time. They plunged Europe into war and usury and lewdness and bestiality and cruelty. And nothing could seem to stop it. The political institutions of Europe collapsed at about 1250, or over the period 1250 to 1267, in a series of wars. A leading figure of the late 13th century and early 14th century, Dante Alighieri, typified those who fought desperately to save civilization from this pestilence of Venice and the Venetians' Mongol allies, who are attacking Europe from the west, or from the east. Venice's power grew. Dante was probably murdered by the Venetians after a trip into Venice and its area. The ideas of Dante lived on through various networks. Not only Dante, but there were great Franciscans and others who continued the tradition, the Augustinian tradition, and developed it then as before. Then in the middle of the century, the 14th century, the whole system collapsed in a chain reaction of bankruptcy, starting with the King of England discovering, by checking with his priest, that not only was usury a mortal sin, but that he, as the King of England, by continuing to pay his debts to usury, was actually contributing to the eternal damnation of the soul of his creditors. So the King of England repudiated his debts to the houses of Bardi and Peruzzi, which were Florentine-based, but they were key bankers of the period, who had looted every part of Europe through this bank. It's very much like the IMF conditionalities today. As a matter of fact, the IMF conditionalities are a repetition, a continuation of the Venetian tradition. They are evil. The people who run the IMF are evil. The bureaucrats of the IMF as a collectivity are purely evil. They are mass murderers. They have already killed far more people on this planet than Adolf Hitler succeeded in doing. They are wiping out the people of developing countries. What they've contributed to with their English masters, including Linda Chalker, who is the colonial minister. They call it overseas development now, but she's really the colonial minister from the House of Lords, who was given to us by Lady Thatcher, who is reputed to be a witch because she succeeded in transforming a merely bankrupt England into a rubbish heap. And also because of the way she handled her pet cat, George Bush. Who, by the way, is no friend of mine. So these people were crushed, and their political power was crushed by their bankruptcy. There's an analogy today. I'm not Plutarch, and I'm not a priest of the cult of Apollo, as he was, but comparisons are sometimes permitted. Today, as then, in the middle of the 14th century, the new Venetian Empire, which is the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, or whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing, is based on financial power. All finance and monetary systems today are divorced entirely from trade and production. They're engaged in pure speculation, in usury, debt as a form of usury, the looting of countries, of whole regions of the world, the power of the ruling oligarchy, which are like Venetian families, Ford Foundation, this foundation, that foundation. This is what runs the United States, not the government. This is what runs the world, not the governments. The governments are run by these powerful families and their oligarchical connections, who control the Washington Post. They control the New York Times. They control the 3 TV networks. They control Jane Fonda. You might not admit it, but she's a real right-wing fascist, that Jane. They are looting the world. They have great power. People are afraid of them. They're afraid of the press. The Congress is afraid of the press. The Justice Department is controlled by these families. Everything is rotten is controlled by these families. People say, be smart, don't get into trouble. Don't attack them. Don't attack the Queen of England. How can you not attack her? She's killing all those people. You're going to keep quiet about it? What, are you going to involve in misprision of a felony by not attacking the Queen of England? So the time has come, we say, well, what if these people suddenly lose their financial power? What if these banks go bankrupt? What if the IMF is liquidated? What if the international monetary institutions don't function? What if there's no facility by which these institutions can exert their power over society? Something like that which happened during the 14th century, the so-called Dark Age.
When in 1000 the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis, that was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066 the Normans took over England, and the Saxons got defeated, and then eventually Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now naturally Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
Centuries had passed from the day the ruling families left Rome, and the Venetians rapidly asserted a maritime dominance that no one could or would dare to challenge. Recognizing her might, the Istrians begged Venice for protection from Slavic pirates. This protection was granted gracefully, at the price of 100 jars of wine per year. Though her mother, Byzantium, interfered with her desire of controlling a global financial maritime empire, as Byzantium still controlled the trade routes of the East, Venice overcame these circumstances and managed to secure trading privileges over Byzantium's territories. They accomplished this by making the emperor fearful of foreign attack, an attack which Venice herself was well equipped to foment. The 20 to 30 rolling Venetian families prided themselves on being descendants of the imperial Rome of Caesar. But whether they were really related by flesh or not, they were descendants of Rome's imperial ideology. For this oligarchy was clearly committed to the ancient model that created Rome, and were determined to ensure that Venice would embody empire.
Be thou unique in the isolation of thy sight. None shall resemble thee. In thy freedom from pope and emperor, none shall rival thee. The city thou buildest on the ooze of the lagoon shall outlast the rock-built cities of the crag and the broad-laid cities of the plain. Out of thine incessant combat with the sea shall come thy strength. Thy soul shall delight in beauty, and beautiful shall be thy handiwork.
Of course, anything that could come from the handiwork of Venice would be anything but beautiful. Her handiwork was one of dumping many into wars, while making them believe that the Venetians were really their ally, and that they shared common interest. Like its descendants in the British Empire of today, Venice had no permanent allies, only permanent interests. To gain her interests, emperors and kings were to play her game, and if they refused or retaliated, they would simply meet their doom. Byzantium was one significant force that chose not to play her game. This was troublesome, for without Constantinople she would lose access to the Black Sea and all the treasures that lay in Asia and the Middle East. Ultimately, Constantinople did fall to the Venetians, not by her own hand, but by the hand she manipulated.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghosts here, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weakness is, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, they have all of their desires sated, they get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
"15 years after Pope Gregory VII undertook major reforms, establishing ultramontane rule over all kingdoms of Europe, Pope Urban II delivered an infamous sermon at the Council of Clermont, consolidating the rule and issuing the orders to crusade, to retake the Holy Lands from the non-believers. Thousands of men, depraved and deprived of knowledge, were convinced to partake in the satanic expedition, as they were promised full exemption from civil jurisdiction and remission of sins. And so they embarked, thousands of them, mercilessly looting and ravishing all in sight, fearing nothing, for all was forgiven. Although they slayed in Christ's name, as they came closer to victory, the one they served as Lord became ever clearer. After the Norman chivalry conquered Jerusalem, envoys were sent to Venice to report the good news. Venice, in turn, immediately sent their own fleets against the weakened Islamic army to capture the ports of Jaffa and Haifa, vital to her own commercial interests. As they prepared to conquer the cities of Tyre and Ascalon decades later, the Crusaders unhesitatingly gave their offerings to their god. A third of each city was allotted to the oligarchy. And it was ensured that within all the kingdoms of the Crusades, a bakery, a bath, a market, and a free quarter were given to the Venetians. They would be exempt from all taxation, while the Christian king of Jerusalem would pay them a tax of 300 bezants annually. The chivalry, with permission by the papacy, went as far as to proclaim that wherever a Venetian went, their laws should follow them, for no law was higher than Venetian law. The only problem the oligarchy encountered in sponsoring these religious wars was that her strategic privileges within Constantinople were threatened. Alexius I of the Byzantine Empire was against the expedition of the Crusaders because they threatened Byzantium's own territories, so he demanded that Venice withdraw. For the rest of the 12th century, measures were taken against Venice by Constantinople, such as the order sent forth by the emperor on March 7, 1171, to arrest and imprison every Venetian within Byzantium's domain. This demonstrated to the oligarchy that her mother was no longer going to play her game, which was troublesome, for without access to the Black Sea, it would be difficult for Venice to secure maritime dominance. All the treasure that lay in the lands of India and China were necessary for Venice to complete her puzzle of extended monetarist practice worldwide. But these crafty devils had no need to fear. A plot lay ready for them to seize as soon as the opportunity arose. At the turn of the 12th century, Saracens waged war to retake the Holy Land from the Norman chivalry. The barons of France and Flanders immediately sent 6 messengers to plead to their birth mother, knowing that only with Venice could they defend themselves. They assembled at St. Mark's, where the ambassadors pleaded to the oligarchy.
Sirs, the most exalted and puissant of the barons of France have sent us to you, and they beg your favor, that you may be seized with pity for Jerusalem, which is in bondage to the unbelievers, and that for God's sake you will consent to aid them to avenge the shame of Jesus Christ. And they have chosen you, because they know that no people on the sea has so great power as you. And they bade us to fall at your feet, and not to rise until you grant that you will have pity on the Holy Land beyond the sea.
All 6 kneeled to the assembly in tears, until Doge Enrico Dandolo delivered the official Venetian reply. Venice assisted the expedition under the condition that they accept a debt of 85,000 marks, the equivalent of 20,000 kilograms of silver. Neither the King of England nor of France generated such an amount annually. As a matter of fact, it would take them nearly 2 years to reach such a sum, and that only if they didn't spend an ounce on anything. Yet, the oligarchy contracted that the debt should be paid within a year. The fools signed Satan's contract, and the result was as Venice expected. The chivalry failed to meet the demands of the contract. The rulers of finance proceeded to utilize their new debt slaves to fulfill the task the empire desired: unchallenged maritime control of the East. Ostensibly, the Venetians only required them to retake their ports in Dalmatia from the Christian kingdom of Hungary. But within a matter of months, Venice's real plot came into effect. By the spring of 1202, 40,000 crusaders, 440 large ships, with 50 galleys were on a direct course towards Constantinople. Upon arrival, as the city walls and gates were broken open, the dogs of war were unleashed, destroying everything, looting from the altars of churches, melting the great statue of Hercules for its bronze, and raping every woman in sight, nuns included. Dandolo and the Venetian fleets kept back, watching their dogs ravish the city. They wanted one thing: the islands and the coasts necessary for their maritime empire, and none amongst the Normans hesitated to grant Venice her desires. Her greatest rival in the Mediterranean was annihilated, and her choices of emperor and patriarch, those who would protect Venetian interests, were appointed. This doge had served the oligarchy well, for Venetian voyages could now continue uninterrupted. With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Shortly after the raids in Constantinople, Venice dictated that all exchange of silver and gold bullion could only lawfully occur within her lagoon. Bullion ships sailed twice a year from the imperial center to keep this private market flowing. Through this method, Venice sucked Europe dry of its 500-year-old silver standard and enforced a gold standard upon them. The Venetian gold ducat, minted in 1284 of October 31st, became the lawful currency of international trade. Simultaneously, with the assistance of the Mongolian hordes, Venice forced China and India off their gold standard and forced upon them instead Europe's silver for the wealthy and paper for the poor. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice. During this same interval, the Venetian financial tyranny saw the rise to power of their junior partners in Florence, the family banking houses of the Acciaioli, the Peruzzi, and the House of Bardi, then the largest banking house on the planet. These, among others, were the banks that privatized the revenues of states by providing the usurious loans to most of the kingdoms in Europe and southern Italy. Although they wielded significant power, they were merely practicing the usury and financial speculation which the Venetian-dominated monetary system required. They were loan sharks swimming within a Venetian sea. The floating exchange rate between silver and gold bullion, controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, caused even the gold florian, minted by the Florentine bankers, to devalue to worthlessness. Nevertheless, the Florentine parasites served their master well, until they became disposable.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which were the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money, so he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away. Because the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt, is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind, and then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more, and you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
While generating profits of 2/3 on all investments in Europe, the Peruzzi, the House of Bardi, and the others would lure in new debt slaves through the yearly champagne fairs in France, using luxury goods imported from Asia as bait. By the beginning of the 14th century, these Lombard bankers were able to insinuate themselves so far into the administrations of both King Edward II and Edward III of England that they ran the king's personal finances, privatized England's revenues, and then charged England for their services. As part of this business, they convinced foolish Edward III to claim France as part of his kingdom, enticing him to spark the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Peruzzi Bank, through the Franzesi bankers, provided the financial services for King Philip IV of France. Thus, through keeping the population in a state of bestiality and manipulating stupid people into wars, the Venetians kept their financial empire on top of the world. But with this practice of monetarism, significant productivity was abandoned, and the body of the state was sucked to the bare bone. The production of wool in England, Flanders, and Spain collapsed. Because of depreciating farmland and equipment, food crises broke out, resulting in repeated famine within the 1310s, 20s, and 30s. The nature of the system caused farmers to go bankrupt, forcing them to hand over their lands to the bankers. For lack of funds and neglect, bridge construction halted, while those built the century before were left to rot. Sanitation was a joke. Monasteries ceased educating the young, and population levels dropped as the system drove further and further towards bankruptcy. The fleas had consumed all the blood of their host. The city of Florence went bankrupt in 1342, and the banking houses of the Acciaioli and the Buonaccorsi followed suit. The Kingdom of France went bankrupt in 1337, and Edward III's England followed suit in 1340. With the fall of these two kingdoms, and Venice playing currencies against each other, the Peruzzi fell bankrupt themselves in 1345, and within the same year, the top bank on the planet, the House of Bardi, finally collapsed. The entire monetary financial system of the 14th century had now entered its phase of complete disintegration. With no legitimate system found to replace the failed one, the conditions were set to pave the way for the great calamity that was about to fall upon Europe. It had already killed 10 million in China, and over the next 2 generations, the combination of plague, social upheavals, and wars wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. In 1508, the League of Cambrai was formed among the significant powers of Western Europe, including Louis XI's heir to the throne and his admirer, Henry VII of England, in an attempt to destroy the monetarist empire still centered in Venice. But with Henry VII's death the following year, and the complicity of the current pope of the time to the Venetians, the League was dissolved. Starting with the Inquisition, and continuing with the promotion of Luther and the Reformation generally, and then supporting the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation, the Venetian Empire had been busy lighting the fuse for religious conflicts throughout Europe. Eventually, among others, they deployed their agent Friar Zorzi to England to manipulate the new king, Henry VIII. They used him to further feed the ongoing frenzy of religious wars by driving him to assume the authority to reform the church in England so he could meet his sexual desires. Fearing the former alliance which sought to destroy the devil, the oligarchy proceeded to move north in search of a new capital from which to operate. They settled throughout northern Europe, opening their first major headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Centuries later, they consolidated their true base in 1763, upholding their public political headquarters in London, which remains still today, yet with their satanic souls continuing to reside in Venice. But this shift to the north was not enough. The scientific achievements of Nicholas of Cusa and the Renaissance crippled the era of Aristotle, making his methods worthless to the oligarchy. The creative impulses of the Golden Age caused an explosion of discoveries and innovations which society was not willing to give up. Venice, then the center of the empire, had no choice but to adapt to those conditions, and thus the doctrines of the Venetian Paolo Sarpi came forth, founding what would become modern British liberalism. This new method of the oligarchy allowed innovation while suppressing creative thinking. It said yes to technology, but no to creativity.
Well, this is Webster Tarpley here in Edinburgh, and I've been studying the Venetians really since about the 1950s, and I actually wrote my senior essay in Princeton about the Italian background of Milton, which leads you right into this Sarpi network. So I've been studying this for quite a few years and given lectures about it. So the basic idea is the following. The characteristic methods of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire did not end when the Roman Empire in the West became extinct in 476 or so AD, nor did they end in the 1450s when Constantinople was captured by the Turks, by the Ottoman Empire. But rather there had been a transfer of a significant part of the Byzantine culture and method in terms of imperialist method, geopolitics, and especially the principle they have that religion serves the state. As you remember in Byzantium, of course, they have this Caesaro-papism, and the emperor is a god, and the religion is a department of the government, because the patriarch is always appointed. He's very much under the thumb of the emperor. Now here in Western Europe, it's always been very different, because here we have the emperor and the pope, or the king and the pope, are different people, and they fight. And this is what has opened up in the Western mind the notion of separation of powers and a kind of an anti-totalitarian bias, because you're not dealing with one power center, you're dealing with two. And that makes all the difference in the world in terms of being able to think for yourself, because you're called upon to choose. And it is no coincidence, of course, that the origins of modern Europe are in these Italian city-states of northern Italy, precisely in the area where the influence of both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, where this crosses. And therefore you have a choice, right? You can be a Guelph and go with the Pope, you can be a Ghibelline and go with the Emperor. Now the Venetians are a branch, they claim, of the Byzantine Empire. And they claim that they go back to the time when Attila the Hun was on his way to Rome, that the refugees fled into the lagoon. So they would tell you that the foundation of Venice is in the 400 AD range, and that's probably too soon. But they do go back a long way, right? And of course, in oligarchy, the antiquity of your family means a great deal. And by that standard, the Royal House of England are complete upstarts compared to any respectable Venetian family who go back 700, 900, 1,000 years. And of course, the normal nobility of England and France don't come anywhere close to that. So it is a conduit for the mentality of the Byzantine Empire to come into the modern world. Now, of course, it is the main medieval banking center. The banking centers of the Middle Ages are basically two. One is Venice, one is Genoa, and they are rivals, but there's much that they have in common, although the Genoese never quite get that Byzantine method. And of course, but what it means is that in Genoa, the place is torn up by faction fights. But what the Venetians have been able to do is to create institutions that allow them to have an oligarchy, but at the same time to have what amounts to a totalitarian and in some ways communistic order under the control of an extremely narrow patrician class of maybe 2,000 people in a society that varies from maybe 500,000 to 4 or 5 million at different times. If we look at their influence, right, by having money lending networks and trade networks, although very seldom manufacturing, that's the big thing with the Venetians. The Florentines under the Medici produce textiles. The Venetians produce very little, a little bit of glass, a little bit of lace, but mainly it's banking, insurance, financial services, and simply trade, which means taking other people's production and turning that into a money on a different market. If we look at, let's say, the Plantagenet dynasty here, the Plantagenets in England are very largely puppets of Venice. The best example is Edward III, and Edward III starts this lunatic adventure of the 100 Years' War, which really is the The destruction of medieval civilization is very largely mediated with the 100 Years' War between 1350 and about 1450, because these are the two most advanced parts of Western Europe, and it is the Venetians who invite and encourage Edward III to do that, because the Venetians are always afraid that the French are going to come and crush them, and the 100 Years' War coincides pretty much with the final struggle between Venice and Genoa, and the French, of course, might have taken that opportunity to conquer both of them. So they make sure that France is completely tied up with this 100 years struggle with the English. William of Ockham, that some people value, I don't, one of the stupidest nominalists of the late Middle Ages, is in his political form, is also completely to be condemned, because he's actually working in Bavaria, King Ludwig of Bavaria. He's trying to essentially, what Ockham is doing is to try to get Ludwig of Bavaria to open a second front against the French, to weaken them even more vis-a-vis the English, and again to make sure the main issue is that the French are not going to give any trouble to the Venetians. Generally speaking, over the years, you'll find that the Venetians have hostile relations to their immediate neighbors, and then beyond that, you might find a belt of states where they have better relations, and the example, of course, is England. The Venetians, I just delved into this a little bit, and I hope to be able to write this up for the 500th anniversary of Luther now in 2017, if I live that long. The Venetian method extends into doing things like this. You have the War of the League of Cambrai in 1509, almost completely forgotten. It is a world war. It is the Great World War at the beginning of the modern era. And at the beginning of it, it's a very one-sided combination. It is essentially France, Spain, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, most of the smaller Italian states, and a few others, all against the Venetians. So it's Europe against Venice. And there's a very interesting painting, the Allegory of the League of Cambrai, which by Palma Giovane, which is displayed in the room of the Venetian Senate. If you're going to go from the Venetian Senate to the room of the Doge and his advisors, you get to go under this painting of a woman on a bull attacking Venice, meaning Venice is anti-European in the deepest sense. They're Byzantine, and they also seek the ruin of all the European powers, and they do succeed in getting out of that fix. But one of the ways they do it is the Venetians are very, very much afraid now, not only of the French, who defeat them in a big battle, which is a catastrophe for them, the Battle of Agnadello in 1509, but the Venetians are also concerned about a huge army coming down from Germany, and at one point, an army of about 100,000 people, if you count the camp followers, one of the biggest armies ever seen in Europe, comes down and besieges the Venetians pretty much in their lagoons. So they respond to that in a characteristic way, which is to try to create a diversion in Germany so that people will be fighting and killing each other in Germany, far away from Venice, north of the Alps, and they won't be troubled by any more invasions. And what they therefore do is mobilize their networks, and they find that the humanist of central Germany, Mutianus Rufus, has a pupil. Mutianus is somebody who has been in contact with Venetian oligarchs, as he writes in his letters. And Mutianus says he's got a protege by the name of Spalatin, another German humanist, who is actually at this time he's rising through the bureaucracy of King Frederick, Elector Frederick the Wise of Saxony, the ruler of Saxony, up in northern Germany, the area around Leipzig and Wittenberg and places like this. And out of this combination of Mutianus and Spalatin, they find Luther. Luther fits their needs to a T, because he's an extremely crude German nationalist, which is a great cover. He's, how can I say it? In terms of theology, he's about as primitive as possibly can be. And he also, interestingly enough, claims that salvation is by faith alone and not by any works. In other words, you're not supposed to, the works of charity are devalued in this. And it just happens to turn out that one of the greatest experts of the Venetian intelligence service, one of the greatest game masters of the last 1,000 years, is a fellow called Gasparo Contarini, who was actually a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church at this point. Or he will be, sorry, at this point he's not, but he will be. And Contarini, in the middle of this crisis of the Venetian state, has had a religious crisis of his own, where he comes about 1 micron away from endorsing the notion of faith alone, salvation by faith alone, that we humans are poor worms and we're not really capable of love, and therefore the only thing we can do is hope that God will help us. And he does this in a way that indicates that it's a doctrinal break. So in about, 1512, 1513, we have Contarini having this experience. And then a few years later, we have Luther having exactly the same kind of experience, just one step further. He says it's faith alone, no works at all. Only grace, only faith, and only by the scriptures. And that basically, that comes out of the War of the League of Cambrai. In other words, most people don't realize that the Luther Reformation comes in a time of war, and indeed of a general European war, which has got Henry VIII in it. In other words, this is when Henry VIII invades northern France, and the French at a certain point are in really bad shape. It's the time of Wolsey and Henry VIII. And they go with Venice most of the time, not completely, but most of the time. So I think that's an interesting example of the Venetian method. The other one that I think is extremely important is Paolo Sarpi. But it even goes back further. For example, let's take Henry VIII. When Henry VIII has his great fight with the Pope, there's this question about, can he marry Anne Boleyn? Can he divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn? So what Henry VIII does is he writes letters to all the universities of Europe, and he asks them, am I right to do this? Is this, can I put away Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn? And he gets back a lot of responses, but the most positive one he gets is from the Venetians in Padua. And there's this character, he's a really kooky rationalist writer by the name of Francesco Giorgi, or Dorzi, who's a Venetian oligarch. He's a friend of Contarini, that we've just mentioned, the guy who basically dishes up Luther for you. And Zorzi comes to the English court, and he delivers the opinion. Henry is delighted with him. And Zorzi then stays at the English court pretty much for the rest of his life as what amounts to Henry VIII's resident sex advisor. So there's an intrigue, and most of the books that you read about Henry VIII don't have this fact. Anyway, Sarpi comes, 75 years later, and Sarpi is concerned with the fact that the Venetians are getting weaker and weaker, and he's got to promote another general war, which is going to become the 30 Years' War. So this is the era of the gunpowder plot of 1605, the Spanish conspiracy against Venice alleged in 1618, and then the defenestration of Prague, right? The beginning of the 30 Years' War, also in May of 1618. And what you see here is that Sarpi is the ego ideal of many people in England. In other words, there's an English cult of Sarpi, which would include such people as John Donne, Sir Francis Bacon, Thomas Hobbes, John Milton, other people maybe less known, Sir Dudley Carleton, Foreign Secretary, Sir Henry Wotton almost became Foreign Secretary, the guy who brought the Palladio architecture to England and otherwise was the provost of Eton, various other churchmen, the Herbert family, Herbert of Cherbury. Also, these are also ancestors of Bush, by the way, the Herbert. And Sarpi, there's a whole book about Sarpi's Englishmen, right? Paolo Sarpi and his English friends. Sarpi, of course, is the most famous person in Europe who's not a king or a prince, and he's involved in the interdict, the so-called struggle between Venice and the papacy in 1606 and 1607, which he wins. He attracts the imagination of all of Protestant Europe by being a Catholic friar who opposes the Pope on a matter of jurisdiction. Does the Vatican have the right to say certain churchmen who are criminals have to be delivered to the church, or can they be punished in the normal courts? And the Pope, of course, says that it all belongs to me. So later on, you have people like Gibbon, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, is a great admirer of Sarpi. Trevor Roper loves Sarpi, the professor of history at Oxford, Lord Dacre, until quite recently. And, well, we can just go through the list. In other words, Dr. Johnson, they all love this Sarpi.
But what's the Sarpi method?
Well, the Sarpi method, of course, is to create religious warfare. In other words, you have to do a divide and conquer, right? The Venetians believe that religion serves state interest. And therefore, what you have a network around Sarpi, and Sarpi's friends, not just these English ones, but they help. And the other ones that he has a group in Holland, a group in Poland, a group in France, a group in, well, you name it, he's got it. He's got a group in North America, which is a little bit weaker. But what they do is they're essentially involved in making peaceful coexistence impossible. I'll give you one example. In Holland, there were two parties. In the Netherlands, there's the Oldenbarneveld party, and this is the great hero of the Dutch. He created the country, like George Washington. And then there's this other guy who's Prince Maurice of Nassau. So Oldenbarneveld says tolerance towards Protestant minorities inside, peace with Spain, and peaceful economic development based on, manufacturing. The Maurice of Nassau says no tolerance, extreme Calvinism, war with Spain, and loot the Spanish and Portuguese empires with the Dutch fleet. So Sarpi is supposed to be, most academics will tell you Sarpi is a great friend of tolerance and moderation. Of course, he comes in on the side of the extremist Maurice of Nassau. And Dudley Carleton, Sarpi's right-hand man at this point, the Englishman, he intervenes to make sure that Oldenbarneveld has his head chopped off. It's amazing. It's George Washington, and his own country kills him. So this is what the Venetians do, and you can see how they're doing this in all these other countries. One of the things going on is the assassination of Henry IV of France, King Henry IV, Le Bon Henri. And everybody has always said the Catholics did this, but it's not at all certain that the Catholics did it, and it may indeed have been a false flag. It's a Catholic friar who does it, but who sent him there? So the point of this is, what we get to, is that the Whig party in England is the Venetian party. The great aristocrats, right, the court party, the top nobility, people who vie with the king, these are the Venetian party. And I've tried to call attention to this novel by Benjamin Disraeli called Coningsby, 1844, where you get this. He actually comes out and says it in very blunt terms, and I welcome that, because that is a confirmation of research that I had done over decades before I ever heard of Coningsby or ever knew about Disraeli as a novelist in this kind of a context. There's a guy called Sir Edwin Sandys, known as the first Whig, and he is Sarpi collaborates in writing this guy's book and in getting it published. And basically, Sandys and Sarpi are co-authors of a book, and that's the guy who's the first Whig. So if you want to know how did London become this imperial center and banking center, and how did the Foreign Office ever get their method of divide and conquer, you have to look at the Venetians. Walsingham founded the Secret Intelligence Service. And he was trained in Venice. He was a Bloody Mary exile. Had to get
now MI6.
Well, secret in SIS, secret in MI6. So Walsingham had to go to Padua during the time of Bloody Mary, and in that time it's clear he's recruited, he's trained, and he brings back the Venetian method of creating religious conflict. And this is what you see then. This is the background of the gunpowder plot, is that, because that's how Cecil gets it. Cecil, Lord Burghley, Cecil the Elder, Robert Cecil the Younger, And these are contemporaries and enemies of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is somebody who's anti-Venetian. He's actually pro-Catholic. And it basically, the whole idea of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, according to these Whig historians, is bunk.
And Shakespeare uses a lot of these figures as sort of archetypes in his plays.
Well, I mean, he's commenting on all this stuff. In other words, he's trying to warn King James, don't fall into the trap. When Elizabeth is alive, he's trying very hard to educate her. And it's basically, he's always pushing, Shakespeare really does want religious tolerance. And he wants that to be extended to the very large Catholic minority, which may even be a majority, we don't know, in England at this time. And again, that's a fact that the Whig historians have completely blotted out. So as Disraeli writes in Coningsby, if you don't know these things, it's because you've had your history written by the Venetian party, and it has been in their interest to suppress all awareness of this huge Venetian presence in Britain. And it includes the money, because you say, well, how does the Bank of England emerge in the late 1600s? And part of it is the huge family fortunes are transferred from Venice first to Amsterdam primarily, and then on to London, and also here. Edinburgh has its own Venetian story, which is maybe not so dramatic, but it's substantial.
So which are the most important figures in Shakespeare you think come from this idea?
Coming from what? The Cecils, right? The Cecils generally, as a family, are in the Venetian orbit. So therefore, when you see Shakespeare, Polonius in Hamlet is Cecil the Elder, Burghley, William Cecil. Robert Cecil, he hates even more, because that's more in his face when he's in the height of his career. So this is now Richard III, is Robert Cecil. Caliban is the misshapen creature of the Tempest, monster. That's Robert Cecil, who was a hunchback, so Shakespeare goes after him on that. Lord Angelo in Measure for Measure, if you know, the hypocrite who spouts moralizing sermons while attempting to abuse women and do all this stuff. This is also part of the attack on the Cecil. So you can go on. I recommend here this book called Shadow Play by Claire Asquith, which is it's a very perceptive reading of the Shakespearean canon based on the important understanding that Shakespeare is this Catholic subversive, Catholic underground activist. And the other book on this is Hildegard Hammerschmidt Hummel, Hummel. I think it's called The True Face of Shakespeare. It just came out in English. And this, what she shows is that Shakespeare got his little Latin and less Greek in a Jesuit college in the Low Countries, and that during the lost years, he was, of course, in Rome at least once a year to visit the Jesuit English college in Rome, the Collegio Inglese. And this, of course, has to do with what people have noticed, if you're at all perceptive, that he knows everything about Verona. In other words, look at these Shakespeare plays, right? Where are half of them set? It's either Venice or Verona or Milan, right? Measure for Measure is about the Duke of Milan, and all the rest of it. And indeed, the Tempest is, it's got to be who's going to be the Duke of Milan, or is he a usurper? So think of all this and realize that that's the conflict that's being fought out. Now, look, from our point of view, we'd have to say we are in the tradition of Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is trying to prevent false flag operations. If you look at Macbeth, Shakespeare is saying, look, fellow Catholics, I'm a Catholic, so are you. Don't be a patsy. Don't fall for Cecil. If Cecil sends you some provocateur double agent who says, let's go out and have a terror plot, don't be so stupid as to fall into this nonsense. That's pretty much Macbeth. And then you see these other plays. Othello is an attempt to warn James, watch out for that Iago that you have running the show. That's Cecil, Robert. And then the other one is King Lear, right? In other words, if you're King Lear, don't give your kingdom away to somebody else, Goneril and Regan. But it really means Cecil, because the idea was that King James, in his pedantry and his ineptitude, he really turns the government over to Cecil. And Shakespeare is saying, you can't do that. Not with Cecil, anyway. So the Cecil, Carol Quigley that you mentioned before, Carroll Quigley, writing in the 1930s about Lady Astor and the Cliveden set, he writes about the Cecil bloc, and what he means by that is the Conservative Party. Right? There's a Lord Salisbury who's Prime Minister in the late 19th century, right, during the height of imperialism. So the Cecils are still around. I don't know if they were around, as individual names. I think they are, but I don't know exactly who they are.
So how did the Cliveden set operate? I mean, what were sort of methods to run the empire and expand the empire?
We just go back a little bit. If you wanted, the predicament of the 20th century is basically this, right? That the British Empire in the second half of the 19th century has already begun to decline because there's a failure in mass education here. Right? You're not giving people enough. You haven't opened up your universities for a scientific and technological education for a whole lot more people. Because the Oxford, Cambridge aristocratic snob mentality has dominated, and therefore people, they don't want to do science and technology. There's a much greater prestige attached to dilettanting in literature and history and things like this within this Whig model. So you see the Germans beginning to get ahead, the French beginning to get ahead, even the US begins to get ahead. And so you have this empire which is slowly declining, right? In the 1890s, you have a big pound crisis around Barings Bank and the Venezuelan debt crisis. So by the time you get to about the late 1890s, you have a situation which is not good. And then you have the Boer War. Now, here's this. Remember we had the League of Cambrai before, 1509? Everybody gangs up on Venice. Well, when the British, in 1899, right, the Boers of South Africa revolt, and the British have some huge defeats in the first couple of months. And what they see at that point is that they're universally hated. Because what happens at that time is that Count Witte in Russia puts out a bid to Germany and France saying, look, look what they're doing, these British, right? Why don't we have the continental bloc? Let's have an alliance of France, Germany, Russia. And let's stop spending all our money on armaments, and let's have a peace race, and we'll pull ahead of the British because we won't have this crazy arms race, right? We won't need to be at each other's throats all the time. And there was interest in the circles of a guy called Gabriel Hanotaux, and some others in the French foreign policy establishment. But the person who saved the British Empire at that point is Kaiser Wilhelm, Emperor William of Germany. He's an absolute idiot and an Anglophile. The first thing he wanted when World War I was over, he said, I can finally have another cup of English tea. And he, of course, had a hate-love relationship with his English mother. So he had a very complex psychology. So that was, you can say that the Boer War is a League of Cambrai moment when it almost came about. If this stupid German emperor hadn't said no, there could have been the Continental Bloc, and at that point, the Foreign Office divide and conquer stuff would just not have worked anymore. And of course, the king, the Prince of Wales, up until the early 1900s, and he's going to be king for all, but he's been Prince of Wales for about half a century, is Edward VII. So what Edward VII does is he goes into high gear. He's a tremendously important figure. He is the most energetic and successful operative of the House of Hanover, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Guelph, by far. And what he does is he creates the Triple Entente. He creates the Nutcracker alliance of Russia and France to crush Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the British fleet, of course, blockades all of them. And that's your recipe for World War I. So if you want to say one person who contributed the most to preparing World War I and allowing it to get going, it's him. Of course, he dies in 1911, but you would have to also add that a lot of the people who actually carry out the war, Admiral Sir Jackie Fisher of the Admiralty, Sir Edward Grey of the Foreign Office, Winston Churchill, they're all personal proteges of Edward VII. So his networks are the ones that take you into this war. Now, the war is, of course, a catastrophe. And it's interesting that in this case, even the aristocracy is massacred on the battlefield because it gets to be out of all conceivable proportion. World War I is a catastrophe from which we really have never recovered. Nobody has, because then it leads. World War I is bad enough that out of that you get fascism, communism, depression, and World War II, and a Cold War, and now we've just woken up from that into the hangover of globalism and economic liberalization. But now the Astor set. By about the 1930s, the big fear is Stalin, because Stalin has decided to industrialize the Soviet Union, and he's succeeding, and this is becoming a huge power. So there are people who look around, and of course you always have a choice, right? The government in London could have said, well, we're going to get out of the Depression, and we're going to go to comprehensive economic development. We're going to have a solid alliance system where we stick with the French and some others, and we will be able to get through it. And indeed, we try to promote economic recovery in Germany, but they didn't do that. They have the reparations going on, right? The world economy is crushed by the Versailles reparations. So what they say is, look, we can't do anything about Stalin, but what we can do is let's create a kamikaze regime in Germany and play them against Russia and get rid of both of them. And what we want to do is put in somebody who's only going to go east. So of course there's this demagogue Hitler running around. He's actually a creature of German military intelligence, a Field Marshal Ludendorff and people like this. So well, let's put him in. And he's a racist, and he's got this anti-Slav ideology. The problem is he also had an anti-British, anti-French ideology because of the Versailles business. So he's somebody who's going to go in both directions. So what the Clifton set amounts to, and that's Lord Astor, Lord John Jacob Astor, and the other one, two of them. Lady Astor is an aristocratic Confederate from Virginia. Lord Brand, Lord Lothian, Lord Halifax, anyway, a bunch of lords. They represent the pro-Hitler group in the British ruling class. There's also the Duke of Hamilton. There's Lord Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. And then, of course, you have people like Prescott Bush, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles in the United States. They're all pro-Nazi. And they're all essentially involved in this idea of divide and conquer in Europe. So we're going to build up Hitler. We're going to make sure we get Hitler. In other words, they don't want to have a military government. They don't want to have a democratic government. They want Hitler because they feel that he is a madman, but he's motivated by this racial theory, and that he's going to go east. So they consider him a one-way gun. You can read, anyway, all kinds of stuff about the Clifton set. I've written some essays about it myself. Carol Quigley is quite good on many aspects of the Clifton set. So Sir Neville Chamberlain, the so-called appeaser, is a creature of this group. That's his social milieu. In other words, where does he go on the weekend? He goes to Cliveden to hobnob with Lady Astor, Lord Astor, and the rest of these people. The specific way they did it was that Lady Astor's hobby was welfare, sort of literacy and health care for poor families, stuff like this. So in one of the Stanley Baldwin governments, Chamberlain, and he's the son of Joseph Chamberlain, who was the mayor of Birmingham, I think, and a great imperialist around the turn of the century. Joseph Chamberlain was a big imperialist ideologue. Neville Chamberlain gets to be the health minister, and Lady Astor cultivates him then, because that's her specialty, and she eventually gets elected into the parliament too. So in that way, Chamberlain is drawn into this group, and that way he becomes not an appeaser, because that's not the idea. He becomes pro-Hitler in the sense that he wants to build up Hitler, and a deal might have been possible. In other words, a deal where, for example, Germany took the lead in attacking the Soviets, and the British were kind of a benevolent neutral on the side of Hitler. The problem with it was that Hitler said, look, you have a democratic government, and Chamberlain, if you lose the election, how can you guarantee me that the next guy won't be against me? And an interesting thing at this point, the British people generally don't like Hitler, and that's very good. And that's what Hitler points to. He says, look, your population hates me. What if you fall and some other government comes in? How can I be sure that I can trust you? And if you know the orchestration of the Munich conference is it's a stunt. I would call it a false flag, but it's something along those lines. Because essentially what they do with the Munich conference is there's already an understanding between Hitler and Chamberlain that Czechoslovakia is going to be carved, it's going to disappear. But what they do is they have to create the illusion of imminent world war so that then everybody will accept the fact that Czechoslovakia is going to be compromised. In other words, you get people hysterical. What Chamberlain does is he says, start digging bomb trenches in the parks and start giving everybody a gas mask. So somebody comes to your house and gives you a gas mask, you get terrified. So they stampede the people into not opposing this Czechoslovakian sellout. And that way, Chamberlain gets a couple of more years to go along with his policy. And that's what starts World War II. So what turns out is that when you play this geopolitics, eventually you antagonize everybody, and maybe they gang up on you, or you blunder into war some other way. So what the result of that is that geopolitics does not work. And tell that now to the people in Washington, because these are now the amateur bunglers who are trying to practice geopolitics. They say, ha ha ha, we'll box in Iran, right? We'll have Pakistan in crisis and attacking them. We'll have Afghanistan going on. We'll have the Kurds going on. We'll have Iraq going on. We'll have 1,000,001 secret armies coming in of terrorists and PKK and PJAC and all the rest of it. The problem with that is, if you don't have a positive conception of a peace order, you're going to have war. And eventually the war is going to come and get you. And the basis, of course, in the modern world, the basis of a peace order is always an approach to international economic development. And of course, this is what the Astors didn't want. So that's an idea of them as people who literally they choose to support Hitler, and then it backfires, blows up right in their face. And that accounts for the desperate situation of Britain in the fall of 1940 and during 1941, because they could have supported the French, but they didn't at various key points. In other words, they basically dumped the French and didn't treat them as a real ally.
the enemy has to be defined properly. Who is the enemy? Well, Cheney is ready for the rubbish bin. He could go quickly. He's earned it. I mean, the Lautenbach report, Lautenbach-Waxman report on the way he's ripped off the American budget, the American till, with his aid of his Halliburton associates, and how he has profited by what Halliburton has done by the way of the steel business, is really puts him in jeopardy. He's not a popular guy. He's hated. Unfortunately, he's also feared, and cowards fear him. But the enemy is not Cheney. Cheney is only a tool, as his wife describes him. The enemy is the Venetian faction. What the problem today in economy, which has to be addressed, and this is where Democrats lose their nerve. In the Senate and elsewhere, they lose their nerve. And it's not that they don't lack inspiring causes to go to, but when they know and they are informed by people like Felix Wahatan and so forth, that they are treading in dangerous waters, which they might not like to find themselves in, they wince. The biggest of what we have is the defection of Republicans from the Republican cause. Not the Republican Party as such, but from what the neocons represent in the Republican Party. So you have a mass defection of Republicans who cannot support what stinks. But you don't have Democrats, with a few exceptions, who are stepping up to the plate, as it is said, on issues, because they're afraid of what? They're afraid of the financial interests. We have to realize that the enemy of humanity today is the same enemy that Franklin Roosevelt had when he was alive, which sometimes are called the bankers, but he didn't think of the bankers, he had it right. He understood that the financial oligarchy, including the grandfather of the present president, Prescott Bush, had been the authors of funding Hitler's being put into power in Germany. That these people in the American oligarchy, the Wall Street oligarchy, the backers of Coolidge, the controllers of Hoover, these were the people who had put Hitler into power and Mussolini before him and Franco afterward. These were the people who were prepared to support Hitler all the way and his system if he had only gone eastward first against the Soviet Union rather than against France and England. They turned against Hitler. Many of them didn't turn until 1940, but they began to turn against Hitler when it was learned the German military was prepared to strike westward first before striking eastward. So they became anti-Hitler because they didn't like his direction. They liked his methods, but not his direction. And they supported him by bringing fascism, Nazism into power in Germany, and fascism into power throughout continental Europe. Now you understand then, you have to go back to deeper, that fascism, Nazism, which is largely a product of a group known as the Syndicus International. It's a group of bankers in the Venetian tradition. These are independent family banks, family financial interests, which cluster like a slime mold together and have individuality, but they also are a slime. Okay? This is the problem. These guys have come to the point where since 1939, when there was no longer, since there was no longer a Soviet Union as a contender, they felt free to destroy Western Europe and the Americas because they no longer needed Western Europe and the Americas as an economic and military strength to control the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was gone, they said,
history has ended, as Francis Fukuyama put it. History is now at an end. Now the empire can return. Now, the empire means the Venetian model, which means the British model. It means the Anglo-Dutch liberal model, under which, in their view, the nation-state either should not exist, and they intend to eliminate most nation-states, which is what the real purpose was in Iraq, not to defeat Saddam Hussein, was to destroy Iraq, which they're doing. Their intent is to destroy Syria. Their intent is to destroy Iran. Their intent is to destroy Israel. The intent is to destroy every part of that region of the world and beyond. And they call them failed states. You know, why does it fail? Because it got killed. That's why it failed. Then what about the other states? Well, they do not want to tolerate in Europe or in the United States a government which does not submit to the power of a financial oligarchy. Now, what these guys are up against is, which Felix Rohatyn really typifies, is they represent a financier oligarchy which says clusters of these bankers are going to run the world and no government will challenge the authority of these bankers, of their money. That's what the issue is. And they not only use the threat of financial campaigns against politicians and their constituencies, they also kill. They commit murders. They murder officials. They murdered Kennedy. They murdered McKinley. They murdered other people en masse. They are killers. They don't do it personally, generally. They give the orders. And they can find Nazi types like the Pinochet types and so forth who will go out and carry out those orders. That's the way it's done. So there is a genuine fear of these bankers or these financier interests among people who know that they hire killers. Most of the assassinations of the world are run, orchestrated by these financial agencies. They kill. They are poisonous cockroaches in our system, inhabiting the pores of our system. And that's what the problem is. People are afraid of them. Again, the answer, as I said just a while ago, the answer is if you don't have a sense of immortality, of an immortal interest in your life, you don't have the source of courage to make the kinds of decisions that challenge power, evil like that. What they represent, what Felix Rohatyn typifies in his own small way, is Satan. You want a figure for Satan? That's him. Not him personally as such, but he typifies what is satanic in society today. This is the evil. And people are afraid to stand up against evil. They say, look, I'm willing to do whatever is possible to reform the society for the better. But look, don't get me in trouble.